Thank you for the great introduction, Peter. You've done a good bit of the work for me in introducing myself and TechnoServe. So I'll get right down to the outline, and also just thank you to the symposium and Soy 360. This is a great honor, and I'm very happy to join this symposium. So today's presentation from myself and Jonathan, just a quick overview here. I'll go briefly through TechnoServe and our link to food processing. But as I said, Peter, you did a great job there introducing that already, so maybe we can move quickly through that. And then I'll get to really what was for us the sudden arrival of COVID and for others in the industry, and how that was quite disruptive and really left us floundering and really needing data rapidly to help inform our response, both the industry response and our response in support of the industry. I'll then go through some of the survey findings, and I will take a lot more time to go through it in more detail. So today I'll just try and highlight a few key aspects of our findings, and then I'll hand over to Jonathan Thomas, who will talk to some more specific case studies and examples of those responses and adaptations in the industry. And hopefully we'll have time to field some questions after that. So yeah, TechnoServe, just for those who don't know us, we help grow strong markets that create opportunities and income for poor people. And we do this by helping enterprising women and men in the developing world to help build stronger farms, businesses, and industries. Businesses like food processors and industries like the food processing industry. So we work fairly often with world leaders and food companies. We work with donor agencies and government bodies. And we really, for TechnoServe, we recognize food processors at the center of the value chain being really critical in the sort of multiplying their effect they have up and down the value chain. So they are, the marketplace, in a very important marketplace for smallholder farm products, for example, and they produce quality and safe and nutritious foods that can go out there for consumption and ideally improve the access to those foods. Just some examples of our reach. We worked in the last sort of 10 years in about 10 countries across Africa. We've delivered customized technical assistance, a sort of one-on-one assistance with over 370 companies, and trainings to a wider number of hundreds of more other companies, including government agencies and sort of supportive business development companies. So that's a bit of a background on TechnoServe. Now I'll get to the sort of COVID challenge. For all those who are in the industry, it came as a fairly quick shock to all of us in early 2020s with government lockdowns and a lot of other things that were suddenly, fairly quickly imposed, and there was a lot of confusion in the industry. And what we saw and what sort of transpired was this sort of massive pressure test of the industry with sort of leaks and cracks showing themselves and vulnerabilities. And for us, as a supportive agency to try and help the industry and for the industry itself to adapt, there was a real need for data. Everyone was sort of kept confined, on a back foot. And so we needed data to be able to react and respond appropriately. So for TechnoServe, what we thought, a way to quickly do this was to go to our existing database of companies that we'd been supporting over the years. So we conducted a few surveys. One survey in early April, at the initial onset of the first wave of lockdowns and things like that came through, market closures. And then we did a second follow-up survey in July to see how they were adapting, and some of our own work was taking hold. And then in September, again, we did a slightly lighter touch survey, recognizing that survey fatigue could be setting in. But we did a lighter touch survey in September just to monitor progress and see how it was progressing. What we found in our surveys is we were able to categorize the findings into 4 major business dimensions. One being the marketing, sales, and distribution side. The other one being the business's finance. And then on the supply, the supply of raw materials and inputs. And then the workforce that runs the operations itself. So as I mentioned earlier, there's quite a lot of findings in this. I can't go into too much details, but I'm going to now run through each of these categories and some of the findings we did get. And I'll try and highlight 1 or 2 key aspects of that. And I'll start with the most challenging, which was the marketing, sales, and distribution side. So here, on average, about 75% of all firms surveyed reported challenges in marketing, sales, and distribution. And we found this was consistent for both surveys. So in April and July, it was steady, a little bit worse in July by about 2%. But this clearly was where the most disruption was happening, and it had a big trickle-down effect. But as you can see, it was also not, it was more severe for some value chains than others. 9 out of 10 dairies, for example, were really challenged by this. If we look at some of the adaptations now to this aspect, we can see that many firms were looking for new markets. So a lot of market closures, a lot of market disruption. So it's quite natural that about 1 or 2 of these companies, or half of them, were looking for new markets. There was also a scale back in operations, and a growing, around 28%, a growing interest in digital marketing. Moving over to the supply area, this was probably the second greatest challenge, again, affected by lockdowns and transport disruptions, especially across borders. So we know there were delays, increased transport costs, and things like that. And so that was also consistent across companies, and more than half of all value chains were really struggling with supply to a certain degree. And this included raw materials, but also the inputs, packaging, fortificants, conditioners, and things like that. Looking at their adaptation, with distance, being a limitation, there was a growing shift to more local supply, but this often came at a cost. So we know that the local market quite often was more expensive compared to what they were traditionally able to get. And also, like digital sales options, there's also a growing interest here we see in digital sourcing solutions. Looking at the workforce itself, with every passing month, the awareness was growing. So we recognize that. But the challenge to managing a workforce was still seen as difficult for at least 1 and 2 businesses. Processes had to deal with fear of contamination, with lockdown restrictions on movement, social distancing challenges, general. We also found fairly interesting remarks. There was a general anxiety as job security was put into question. So, there's some real tangible things like the physical distancing, but then there's also the psychological element that was creeping in, where there was this real anxiety, compounded by the sort of, as the health situation became more of an economic one. So some of the adaptations, we can see on the left side here, there really was quite good information sharing and adoption of PPE. There was good adoption of implementation, at least, of training protocols around COVID. So the hygiene side of it was well messaged, well understood, and companies were doing a lot. You can see also, more than 3/4 of the companies, 77%, had to make changes in their workforce operations. So what that looked like, for example, many companies introduced new work shift routines, increasing the number of work shifts and reducing the number of people per shift. trying to reduce the sort of density of staff on the in the workplace. There's still room for improvement, I think. If you look at the 61% of daily health screening, that means 39% were not doing that. So I think there's definitely some room for improvement there. On the financial side, this has also been a challenge, especially with the decrease in sales that you could see from the earlier statistics. That's having a knock-on effect on working capital. So in July, we saw about 40% of firms reporting challenges in accessing finance. And we see in their sort of reaction to this, a third or more were seeking finance, different types of finance. And this was a continuously increasing statistic. So in April, this was 14% as an example. So it was rapidly growing space. And we also, from some of the comments, recognize, look at this earlier comment, for example, that it was received, that it was fairly negative response from the lending industry. They feared the risk of repayment, naturally. So there's definitely a lot of room there for improved financial mechanisms. Excuse me. One thing we were able to do, which we found very interesting, knowing the companies we worked with and their ownership structure, was to look at to sort of the different gender disaggregation of these businesses and how those fared. And we were quite startled at the sort of significance here in recognizing a noticeable increase in challenges faced by female-owned businesses. This was for all but the finance component. And this raised, really an important finding for us. And in my view, it calls for more investigation, more targeted gender programming response and research. And trying to understand, for example, what these disparities are. Is this a result of sort of historic inequalities like education and family wealth, or are they more specific to COVID? We know, for example, that women are often the primary caregivers in a family, and the pandemic has increased the responsibility on caregivers. So I think that's was a useful side finding of this surveys. Adding in the September findings, the check-in, and looking at it as a sort of trend here, there's some cautious optimism, I think. If we look at September results, and these results, by the way, are all based on the previous month. So how was your sales over the previous month? The decrease in sales, there was a decline in sales, right, to 39% from 68% in July. So that's great to see. And there was an increase in sales from the previous month, from 10% to 36%. But we have to recognize, right, that was from a really low baseline. So a lot of damage was previously done. So you're improving from a low baseline. Certainly doesn't reflect, an increase in sales on a normal year. But perhaps it reflects the bottom of the curve, right? So maybe they've turned a corner, and that gives us optimism. And that optimism was reflected in the last question here about how they saw the future of their sales. And with every survey, that looked more and more promising. So just looking at all that data and what it meant for us as TechnoServe, it really helped us adapt our response. The data, it illuminated many challenges, and it shows us really that the situation is evolving. The different companies are at different stages in their evolution and require a different response. So, as the outbreak came out, most companies were in the sort of survival reaction mode, dealing with the shock. Some of them are still there now as they enter a new phase of sort of a struggle. But a lot of them have adapted and are in a recovery phase. Some of them are even optimizing. So for us, in support of these businesses, we really had to look at meeting them where they are. Maybe they need still further help with the risk management and new protocols. But with other companies, we're really helping them to optimize against the opportunities that they've seen, perhaps on import substitution and things like that. So with that, I'm going to hand over to Jonathan to talk a little bit about more of our specific responses and case studies. And I'm going to keep sliding through the screen here to keep the timing down. So over to you, Jonathan.
Yeah, thanks, Brent. So I'll talk a little bit about responses specifically under the AINFP program, the Alliance for Inclusive and Nutritious Food Processing, which is working with about 60 processors across 5 countries: Ethiopia, Kenya, Tanzania, Zambia, and Malawi. So, and I'll show these in terms of the 4 areas that Brent has talked about. So initially, the primary concern for processors in the initial stages of COVID back in March, April, May, was really protecting their workforce, making sure that they were able to work, they were, as far as possible, prevented from catching the virus, and that they were able to remain operational and within government guidelines. So, you know, governments across the region, World Health Organization, were sharing health guidelines, but they were fairly generic. So we tailored those more towards the food processing sector, shared those with our processors, and specifically looked at how, on a very practical basis, do you practice physical distancing in the factory setting? How can you maintain production? And actually what's happened is many processors moved to multiple shifts. So they would reduce the workforce on any given shift, but increase to 2 or in some cases 3 8-hour shifts. And then we're able to at least maintain a good level of production. PPE and sanitizer in the early days was in very short supply. For instance, in Kenya, there was nobody, pre-COVID, there was nobody producing PPE in the whole country. It was all being imported, so what was available was quickly snapped up. So we were able to help them source PPE. We helped some processors start production of sanitizer. So we have a processor in Zambia, for instance, which is producing for its own use and also selling to other processors. And introducing health protocols, so screening when staff came to work, making sure that all staff entering the factory and visitors were recorded, temperatures taken, and a basic tracking system in place. On finance, we've seen that many processors face a real cash crisis. Sales, in many cases, plummeted in the short term and are still only slowly recovering. This meant that they were struggling to repay loans. So we facilitated discussions with banks to restructure those loans, delay payments, give them a payment holiday, give them a reduction in interest in the short term in some cases. We help them with cash flow forecasting. So of course the cash flow had suddenly been dramatically altered, so helping them readjust their forecasts. And then put them in link them up with specific funds. So the governments in some countries had funds for businesses, essential businesses like food processors, to keep going. And also with other agencies, we established a pilot grant facility for resiliency of the food processing sector and have dispersed funds of $50,000 each to 10 different processors across the region, just to help them focus on payment of staff, purchase of raw materials, payment of suppliers, etc. Again, just to keep that business alive through that survival phase. On marketing, sales and distribution, we saw that some markets collapsed completely, particularly hospitality industry. So we saw anybody relying on hotels, and that hospitality industry, restaurants really suffered badly, dairy sector particularly. So we helped them look at their sales and adjust to different markets, looked at linking them up to digital online marketing channels. Some processes went back to some very traditional door-to-door sales. In some cases, we helped them look at diversification of products. So an example would be a dairy in Kenya that had been focused on fresh milk sales, which really collapsed. We helped them adjust to production of long-life UHT milk, for which there was an increased demand. We saw generally an increase in demand for shelf-stable products. And then expansion to new markets. So specifically, we linked them up to another TechnoServe program working in Kenya and Tanzania, where we were working with micro retailers, and we were able to develop new markets really aiming at the base of the pyramid market. And then on supplies, these were also affected because of lockdowns and travel restrictions. So we helped with maintaining those supply contracts, business-to-business meetings to establish new linkages, and pointing them to alternative local sources of supplies. In many cases, supplies of raw material, but also packaging and imported materials were disrupted. So we were able to find them local supplies, even though those were a little bit more expensive and perhaps of lower quality. And I'll give you two examples, specifically soy processors that we work with. The first one in Kenya, so ProSoya is producing fortified soy products which go into relief food, and they have an instant porridge. They also have some animal feed based on soy. But their primary customers are for human fortified foods going into school feeding programs, the World Food Programme. So what was at risk here, if this business collapsed, was about production of about 1,200 tons a year, which equates to about 45 million nutritious meals. A company with an annual revenue of $2 million, employing 67 staff, and sourcing from about 4,000 farmers. So all of that was potentially at risk. And you can see that the immediate impact of COVID was that their sales went down by 70%. Schools were closed, so school feeding programs were no longer able to operate. And that was a major part of their market. They saw an increase in input prices, delays, and increases in transportation and cost of inputs. And this really put a significant strain on their working capital, as a result of which they weren't in a position to buy soy from local smallholder farmers and had to reduce their supply base in the short term by 80%. So areas in which we've worked with them, they were one of the recipients of the resiliency grant that I mentioned. They've received $50,000. That's enabled them to re-engage with their smallholder farmer base, which is 19 metric tons of soy from local smallholder farmers. They've expanded their workforce capacity around a new product. So we had previously helped them with a production of a new product, Ujilala, which you can see in the picture there. It's a sort of a porridge, fortified porridge product. We helped them accelerate the launch of that product and onto the retail market, helped them with the packaging and design of the branding and so on. Trained their workforce in the production, packaging, and distribution of this product, so it's gone onto the market a little bit earlier than they had originally planned, but this has helped them focus on a new product and cover some of the other market failure. We've also helped them invest in improved hygiene and safety measures and facilitated a $1.8 million investment for new plant layout, which hopefully will go live in the second quarter of next year. So we've really kept that business alive. Another soy processor in Zambia, Essential Commodities, also fortifying soya, particularly into textured soy protein, corn blend, and soy oil. Their major product to date has been this textured soy protein, which is quite a popular meat substitute with lower income consumers in Zambia. That's sold through distributors, retail. They have a smaller part of their business is feed processing as well. Again, at risk, a fairly significant business, 2,500 tons of soy production per year, 2.9 million annual revenue, 160 staff, and amongst their suppliers were specifically 500 smallholder women farmers. They saw that their sales went down significantly, increased prices and delays, particularly imported supplies from South Africa and abroad. Severe working capital constraints really made worse by significant devaluation of the Zambian kwacha, 30% over the last 9 months or so. So really in a pretty bad position, struggling business. As I said, with others, we provided them with information on workforce protection, which they put in place, hand washing facilities, sanitization, logging in of visitors and staff. Helped them adjust their workplace practices, so they went to multiple shifts, increased hygiene measures and use of PPE in the factory, and then significantly shifted the production of soy oil. So majority of soy oil in Zambia is actually imported from South Africa. And they have historically struggled a little bit to compete with that in terms of quality. With the border closed for a number of weeks, they were able to take advantage of that and up their soy oil production, introduce some new packaging for the retail market. And we've supported them with an application for a $500,000 loan to significantly upscale that going forward. So we're seeing that we'd help them in their resiliency through the initial shock of the pandemic, and hopefully they're better positioned now as we move forward. So we'll leave it at that. Thank you very much for listening. I'm happy to take any Q&A.
Yeah, yeah, great presentation, Brent and Jonathan. Oh, we got some feedback from Susan. You want to mute them? Let's see. Sorry about that. Yeah, they're now muted. Great. Great presentation, Brent and Jonathan. Really nice survey, and then the case study, really important. I'm going to just throw you one question. We only have a minute or two. If you could just talk, and you mentioned a little bit about border situation, border shutdowns, and now border openings, and how that affected the food processors, either in your surveys or the Kenyan and Zambian firm.
Yeah, so particularly in Zambia, there's a lot of importation of inputs from South Africa. So ingredients that are added, fortificants, machinery supplies, etc. So we saw that the border was closed for quite some while because of the severe lockdown in South Africa. So those parts weren't available, those inputs weren't available, or were significantly delayed, which put up the price. So we really had to switch to local sourcing. And we're quite hopeful that maybe that will continue, that they will be able to continue sourcing locally. Another area was, which you might not think of, was a lot of the machinery used in Zambia is sourced from China. And we were working with a couple of processors there with Chinese engineers to help them install that machinery. And they were unable to travel during that period. So that significantly delayed a couple of our processes in getting up and running and expanding their production.
Yeah, I was just going to add to that point. We did see in the surveys some of the remarks were around the fact that a lot of the industry is supported by these consultants, these international consultants, and with the stop, whether it's someone from Bühler in Switzerland or a South African milling engineer or somebody regionally, and that really stopped. So they had to become self-sufficient and look at a local solution.
Yeah, I just thought it was an important point you guys raised, and a nice case study almost a live experiment about when we have import or export embargoes and policy that really you can see played out through the COVID experience, how that policy really adversely affects, for example, inbound raw material, technical assistance, things like that, but also protects markets for infant firms. So very interesting perspective you guys provide. Thanks. We have some more questions. We'll hopefully at the panel we'll get to them, but great job and really, really appreciate it. Let's move on to our next presentation.